Before we start talking about some objections to the Kalam cosmological argument, I first want to just refresh everyone's mind on what the heck the argument is. So, what the Kalam cosmological argument is it's an argument for God, and it's based on, and the way it works is you have these two premises, and then if the premises are true, because of how logic works, the conclusion must also be true. So, just a refresher, the premises are whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. So, basically, things don't just randomly come into existence without a reason. Premise two, the universe began to exist. And so, therefore, our conclusion is the universe has a cause of its existence. Now, last week I talked about how I didn't want to cover too many objections then because there's a lot. So, today we're going to be doing that. Now, our first objection, and I think is probably the worst one, comes from our great friend Richard Dawkins. Here are some quotes from Richard Dawkins. Quote, "If you tell me that God created the universe, then I have the right to ask you who created God." The other quote, "All three of these arguments rely upon the idea of a regress and invoke God to terminate it." Now, what he's talking about is some common cosmological arguments. So that would include the Kalam, that would include the causality argument, and it would include the teleological argument. Also, kind of uses this sometimes. They make quote, "They make an entirely unwarranted assumption that God himself is immune to the regress. It is more parsimonious to conjure up, say, a Big Bang singularity or some other physical concept as yet unknown." So this way, I want to try something a little different, which is I want you guys just thinking about this for a little bit. Try to think if you can come up with some reasons for why this objection doesn't work. Obviously, you don't have to speak up if you don't want to. Okay, so by regress, he means, so let's take you, for example. I'd say, what caused your existence? Well, your parents met. And you say, oh, well, what caused that? Well, your parents, they were born from their parents, and, you keep regressing that. So he means, by regress, he means like causality. It's like there's a regress in causes. Okay, I can give you privileges, Maria. Da-da-da. There it is. There you go. So you should not be able to speak now. It might take a second, but it should work. Yes. So the idea is as you regress in time, eventually you would reach a point where you couldn't regress further. Like you'd have to be a starting point that didn't have a starting point for it. So what Richard Dawkins is trying to say here is, people say, well, the universe, as we regress, you have all these causes. Well, eventually, so a common argument is then, oh, well, we must then reach a point where there just is a cause that wasn't caused by something else. And usually we say that's God. And so what he's trying to say is, well, if you say that we can do this regress for the universe, why can't we do it for God? So then that's why he asks, who created God?
But God is outside of like time and space. He like no one created him. And like if you keep going back to the regress state, whether he wants to call it God or not, you eventually get to a point where you are like, well, something that is outside of time and space had to have done this, and it has to be an all-powerful being, aka
Yeah,
God.
yeah, exactly. I think that's definitely for me the most obvious objection. Because again, let's look at our argument. We say whatever, we don't say anything, or sorry, everything has a cause, right? It's like, oh, well, everything must have a cause for its existence. No, we say whatever begins to exist. If the universe itself never began to exist, it would also not need a cause, which is what's omitted by the whole argument in itself. And so I really think this really misses the point because it just doesn't make any sense. It seems to misunderstand the argument.
I think it's more that, that argument assumes that you're in a box and God's inside the box with you, which puts a limitation upon the concept of the ultimate being. We're restricted by time, and so okay, let's go back in time. Genesis starts in the beginning. It starts with a point of time, space, matter, beginning, and then it also ends with it as well in Revelations. Heaven and earth, as we know, that realm of time is done away with. There's a new heaven and a new earth outside of time, and so Dawkins' premise is that God's in the box with him, so therefore he can question God because he literally, because of that, he elevates himself to the same level as God and say, well, I've got a beginning and I can trace that, Where's yours? You haven't. You can't prove that you've got a beginning, therefore you don't exist. It's a fallacious argument, and it's confusing because people live inside time, and so to grasp the concept of God outside of time means you actually have to start thinking outside of the box, I think.
Yeah, no, those are great points. And to go off what Mexican K-pop star said, yeah, that's a great point. The question of who created God fundamentally misunderstands what we are saying about God. And I really did like what you said about inside the box versus outside the box. Because I think because oftentimes we hear of God, right? And many people, what they really think of is they think of something like Zeus, right? They think of um, some kind of Greek myth, maybe a Hindu myth or something, where basically you have this, what is effectively just what we would now call like a superhero, right? Like Superman would almost be like a Greek god. Like they're comparable in how they both come into existence. They have limitations in terms of powers. Like, oh, well, Zeus can control lightning, but he doesn't have dominion over the water and, all this kinds of stuff. But when Christians are talking about God, we are not talking about that type of being. We are talking about something that didn't come into existence from something else. It has always existed. And sometimes you'll have people, what they'll say is, oh, well, aren't you committing special pleading right now? Like you're claiming that this being God, he doesn't have a cause of existence, but, the universe and stuff does. Well, anyone who knows a bit of history actually can flip it around and say, well, actually, originally a common atheist argument against God was that the universe always existed. They claim, well, since the universe always existed, why would you need a god to start it? Now, there are arguments that presuppose the eternal universe to then argue for a god. A couple of these come from Aristotle and Aquinas, but ignoring that for now because that's a completely different topic. Ultimately, you can't claim it's special pleading when Christians are claiming this type of entity, while at the same time, you're more than willing to claim a different entity and give it the same property. So that's at least some common objection. Again, it seems very obvious how this would be bad reasoning, but you'd be surprised at how often you'll see it. Because again, remember, this is Dawkins. He's a well-known writer. He's, you talk about atheists like, oh, look at Dawkins or something like this. He wrote an entire book about the God delusion in which these are the quotes that, these quotes come from said book. And even to this day, he's still not admitted that this was an issue. And I think it shows, at least in one sense, that not every atheist is an atheist due to objective reasons. So, moving on to the second objection. The second objection is that the universe just came from nothing. So, this comes from our other friend, Lawrence Krauss, who is a astrophysicist who wrote a book. I forget the title of the book off the top of my head, in which he talked about nothing. In fact, there's a quote, just something along the lines of, well, there's different types of nothings. Nothing has a weight, and nothing has mass, and all these types of things. The quote William Lane Craig, it is a deliberate misuse of language and science, to say the least. When the idea that you could have someone come from nothing is, the quote William Lane Craig, again, worse than magic. It's the most absurd thing you could say. Nothing, by definition, means not anything. You can't have not anything, then cause something. It's so logically absurd, I can't believe I hear it, but I do. So, to give a better steel man, although he is saying nothing, Lawrence Krauss, really that is not what he means. What he actually means is that the universe began due to what are referred to as quantum fluctuations. Now, I am not going to get super deep into quantum fluctuations because, again, it would take an insane amount of time. Quantum mechanics is very hard to understand. And I don't think it's actually necessary I don't think you have to actually understand it in order to find some counters to it. Now, the point of this is to try to prove that the universe could come from a non-supernatural cause. So this is actually not necessarily disagreeing with the argument. You can agree to the argument and say the universe has a cause, while also saying that the cause doesn't necessarily have to be supernatural. Now, I think I'll show why it actually why it makes more sense for it to be rather than not, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Now, are there any objections you could think of just based off this. I can understand why it could be. I'll actually clarify any questions because this is kind of hard to understand. More from small fluctuations between matter and antimatter. Okay, in terms of the matter was born from small fluctuations between matter and antimatter, I think that is correct. If I recall, my memory doesn't fail me. Quantum mechanics is very hard to understand because you're talking on a very micro scale, and you're talking about at a time. Well, I say at a time, but that's kind of misleading because time wouldn't have existed at this point technically, because time came into existence. And to go on to the other point about how science is famous for not being able to measure take form of supernatural, yes, that's almost by definition true because science by itself can only study physical phenomenon. Like the idea of a miracle in itself, part of what makes a miracle is the fact that it's not in common occurrence. Because if it was just a common phenomenon, then you wouldn't call it a miracle. So in order for it to be a miracle, it by definition has to be uncommon. And so it then can't really be measured. Like can't be like, oh, well, if I mix 5 grams of iron, 30 grams of magnesium, and 10 grams of copper, I will create a miracle. Like, you can't just do that. And of course, as I pointed out last week, science isn't the only way to understand things.
I think a miracle, is something that occurs contrary to, like, the concept of time, matter, and space. They're the 3 dimensions that our existence exists in. There's a start to it. There's a time, there's matter, and there's space that occurs. Through those 3 points, that's how we measure history. That's how we measure life itself. And when a miracle occurs, it still appears within time, space, and matter. Blind Bartimaeus receiving his sight. It's just that the miracle occurs, would you say, maybe an accelerated within that space, but that's what determines it as supernatural, is that something has control over time, space, and matter. Philip being transported by the Spirit, from the Ethiopian eunuch. He goes from one location to another. That's a miracle in it. It's supernatural because it's operating outside of time, space, and matter, would be my understanding of what a miracle is.
Yes.
And then the causality of it is it's God that does the miracle because he is outside of time, space, and matter. Therefore, he can do it.
Yeah, so miracles is okay. So I'll talk about this just for a little bit. I don't want to go super deep into this because it's not necessarily pertinent to what we're talking about. But there are a couple different ideas of miracles. So one of them is that when we consider the laws of physics themselves, that really what's going on is it's just how God is basically generally allowing it to happen or causing it to happen. And then occasionally he's just like inserts himself and then causes, let's say, something like a miracle. There's other views on it. So for example, like there's some miracles in which you could say that are of physical phenomenon. So for example, in the example with Moses, when he parts the Red Sea, it, I believe, specifically mentions like a great gust of wind comes and kind of like splits the sea that way. And so in that instance, you do have like a physical phenomenon being caused. But either way, that's kind of not, however you view it on how you want to very specifically define a miracle versus not a miracle. Ultimately, that doesn't really have to do with the strength of the argument and whether or not it's true. Although it is an interesting discussion. If anyone has anything they would like to add, I can give up some issues that I think.
So I think it's funny to hear say like, oh, it came from nothing. Because you can't get something from nothing, and by definition, nothing doesn't exist. And so it's like one of those things where it's like, oh, God doesn't exist. Like, well, maybe, but you know what definitely doesn't exist? Nothing. But I know that they're going with like more, they're trying to use the quantum explanation. But either way, to be able to create something, there has to have been a like a start to it. Like something had to have started it. Something like it couldn't have come from nothing. It had to have come from something, which means something must have placed it there, and that thing had to be outside of space and time.
Yeah, I tend to think like I think you nailed it, which is one of the things when people talk about these quantum fluctuations. I think my immediate question is like, okay, so are the quantum are these things eternal? Because as soon as you start saying the eternal, then we start running into this weird issue where, in order to try to avoid an eternal universe, because we sort of talked about last week about a lot of the weird issues that come from such an idea, you're now interjecting something that then also has to be eternal.
Yeah, it's kind of like how in the previous one too, I had said like they like even if they don't want to call it God, what they're essentially reaching to is God, because God is something that you can't see, taste, feel, or anything like that. It's something that you can't really examine through science, and then they tried to say, oh well, this universe came from something that we can't see, touch, feel, and you can't really examine through science. And I'm like, well, you're just talking about God at that point. You're just using different terms.
Yeah, that can definitely be true. And when it comes to quantum fluctuations, it's at least a type of model that is then based on observations in order to try to understand it. But as I pointed out last week, just because you have a model for something doesn't mean it's accurate or right. There's a plethora of different models of the universe that all contradict each other. If all you like, oh, well, I have a model, therefore you're wrong. It's like, well, no, you have a possible explanation. Model is a very nice way to say that, but you don't have anything more than that. You have a possible explanation. Now, you may have some evidence for it, but again, that just because you have slight evidence for something doesn't mean it's guaranteed true. And I think as we continue going on, we're going to talk about, like, okay, let's say you think the Kalam, maybe it's slightly more plausible that it's God versus something else. And it's like, okay, well, what about this other argument for God? Like, let's talk about the moral argument. Or what about the contingency argument? What about the teleological argument? And as you build your case upon all these arguments, now you're not worried about, oh, well, I only have this one argument, and, God lives or dies based off this one argument. It's like, well, no, I actually have a case that I'm slowly building over time to that then strengthens it and makes it more plausible than not. And yeah, that was really good stuff. I like William Lane Craig talks about this in his Defender series, which is a podcast series where he teaches his own form, does a class based on apologetics. And he talks about nothing for a while because, again, Krauss is very famous for talking about, oh, well, nothing has a weight, nothing causes something. And what he talks about is the issue is, again, it's a deliberate misuse of the English language where you're trying to use nothing from what it actually means, which is not anything, and you're instead turning it into a noun to then basically make it an object, which in the past would have actually been something you would joke about. So, for example, in the Odyssey, there's an instance where the main character is killing the Cyclops. And while he's killing the Cyclops is yelling at him, who you are and stuff. And he says, I'm nothing. Or I'm not anybody. And then the other, yes, thank you. The other Cyclops are asking him, oh, what's causing you to yell out? And he's like, well, nothing is stabbing me. And they're like, well, if nothing's stabbing you, why are you okay? And it's like, well, nothing has blinded me. And all this stuff. And the whole joke is obviously nothing is not a thing. And to use it as a noun to then try to describe something is just to be deliberate misuse of language. And honestly shows, I think, pretty bad character. So, I will end it with one quote from William Craig because I love William Lane Craig and I think this is funny. Quote, something cannot come out of nothing. Think about it. To claim that something can come into being from nothing is worse than magic. When a magician pulls a rabbit out of the hat, at least you've got the magician, not to mention the hat. I think that's pretty funny, and I think it very much illustrates the big issue with it. Now, our third objection, the cynical universe / eternal universe, because it kind of ends up being the same thing. Now, what this model purports, and it's another scientific model. This is most famously comes from, Roger Penrose, who was a colleague of with Stephen Hawking back in the day. There's actually a very interesting interview between him and William Lane Craig on the Unbelievable podcast. I would totally recommend it. It's super interesting stuff. And they basically go at it on Roger Penrose's model for the universe and whether or not it's accurate, and a couple other things, and whether or not it actually has theological importance. But what this model basically says is that the universe first expands. So you can see that here where it's slowly expanding out. So this right here, if you imagine if we turned it so that way you're looking top down, you'd see basically like a flat circle. And that circle is slowly expanding over time. And then it eventually reaches a point where time and entropy, quote unquote, reverse direction. Now, it's important not to think by time by time reversing direction that what's happening is like you're reversing a video. That's not what is meant. So as time is quote unquote reversed, the universe starts shrinking back into itself and then collapses to that singularity point. And then that singularity point once again expands, and you can imagine again, it expands, contracts, expands, contracts. And it basically does this forever. Now, hearing that, one obvious issue I see is that you have the issue of, again, an eternal universe. We've already talked about this before. An eternal universe has serious logical and philosophical issues with it that seems to make it incredibly improbable, if not impossible, that that could actually be true. Now, the way some try to get out of this, so Roger Penrose, the way he tries to get out is, what he says is, well, what's actually happening is, time, or t, is going up, and then as a reverse direction, it goes back to 0, but that it's actually not. So, and then once it collapses, it expands again. And what he basically tries to say is the previous universe isn't really a previous universe because, once you reach t0, it's not like you go in t-1, t-2, or t-3. Does that make sense? Like, could I understand how that could be kind of hard to understand? Or I shouldn't say kind of hard. It could be very hard to understand. And yes, you're right. It is very weird that the universe would suddenly collapse. There does seem to be some scientific issues with that, and a lot of reasons why many don't take this view.
I'd say it's because the conclusion I think they come to that is because they do it with math.
Yes. Yes.
So math can, if you got t as time, you can mess around with mathematics and make t equal the negative. But the evidence shows that you can't do that with time. Even the postulation of, going through a wormhole and, being able to go from one point to another, you're postulating that. You haven't experienced it. You can't measure it. You can't scientifically look at it and say, oh, yes. You could possibly prove it theoretically, but it's still a theory when you do that. So, that argument, the universe reaches a certain stage and then reverses back. Well, then you're asking, okay, what evidence do you have that this actually occurs? And I think that dismantles the argument. So time goes forward, and then suddenly time appears to go backwards. But evidence that we have is that time is in continuum.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. And oftentimes when we're talking to people, you may have someone bring up this objection. You might be like, man, how am I going to tackle this? It's like, well, actually, first, have they actually proven their case? I think too often us Christians, we can sometimes take on the unnecessary burden of assuming that every thing said to us must be true. Like, don't place an unwarranted burden where you have to suddenly prove God, and the person whose objection to your belief in God just has to prove basically nothing. They just have to say something that could possibly be true and then not provide any evidence for it. And I think one of the big issues also, and this was brought up by William Lane Craig to Penrose, is it makes absolutely zero sense how you can claim this universe is not before this universe. If you're expanding contraction, okay, so you're saying that the math says time now equals 0. So we've just got back to the original starting point. You can say that, but I don't see how philosophically or logically that makes any sense. How does it make any sense to claim that a previous state of the universe was actually not a previous state of the universe? Because according to the math, t equals 0. To me, it seems at least highly implausible, to say the least. And it also does suffer from another issue, which is, remember, these are scientific models. That means these have to conform to the scientific method. These are not philosophical claims. They're not philosophical arguments. So they are not beholden to philosophical proofs. These are beholden to scientific proofs. And when it comes to these models, I think you nailed the head string, which is that how can you possibly prove that the universe shrunk and then expanded again? By definition, you can't, because these are entirely different universes. You cannot interact with these universes.
I would also say it doesn't really move the argument or it doesn't disprove God because there had to have been a first cycle then. So then what caused the first cycle? Like at some point, this had to have started still. It's just putting another middleman between what caused it all and where we're at.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. And so the way Roger Penrose tries to get out of it is again by saying that basically what's happening is let's imagine a number line from let's say t equals 0 to t equals 100. And let's say 100 is like full expansion of the universe. Basically what he tries to say is t approaches 100, it eventually reaches 100, and then it goes all the way back to 0. So he says, well, then if you talk about a previous universe, you're basically talking an absurdity because there is no previous universe. We just went back to the beginning. But again, I think that when you think about it longer than 10 seconds, it's like, well, okay, your math might say this, but I think pretty substantial reasoning, it seems quite clear that although you can claim it mathematically, logically, it does not make any sense. And it seems to me I have no significant reason for why I should conclude that just because the math says this, it must automatically be true. Math can say a lot of things, but just because it says it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And to assert that is now getting into the realm of philosophy, in which case we can talk about it there. But of course, that's then ignoring what we're talking about right now. So, does that make sense to everyone? Or does anyone else have anything they would like to add? Okay, so let's go on to the last major objection. Now, to be fair, there are more objections than the ones I am currently listing. It's just to save a lot of time and also to give the more common ones, because again, there's a billion models out there. One book I have is called the Blackwell's Companion Guide to Natural Theology. It's a incredibly dense book, and it's got about 100-page chapter on just the Kalam, and there's I think close to a dozen or so different models talked about, and scientific models, and explaining all the scientific issues with them, as well as the philosophical. I had hiccups for a second. Now, the fourth objection, and I think this might be the one you'll most likely see, is the God of the gaps fallacy. Now, before continuing on, I want to talk about what the God of the gaps fallacy is. The God of the gaps fallacy refers to the argument that gaps in scientific knowledge are evidence for God's existence. Notice the phrase gaps. This is very, very important. Is this a direct intervention? One example of the God of the gaps argument is the argument from ignorance, or argumentum ad ignorantum, which is just a very fancy way of saying argument from ignorance. So, why does this not work? Well, for one, we are not saying that we don't know how the universe began, therefore God. This isn't out of ignorance. We're saying, hey, this is what we do know. We seem to know that things that come into existence have a reason for existing. They didn't just spontaneously appear in the universe. I don't have to worry that an elephant is about to spawn above my bed at night and crush me underneath it. Things don't do that. We also know that it seems like a past eternal universe has serious logical and reasonable issues with it. And so with this evidence, I am now claiming that it is possible that the cause is a God. Another issue with this argument this counter argument is that nowhere in the actual argument does it mention God. The reason why the conclusion leads to significant theological importance that seems to indicate a God, but that's not necessarily what it's saying. You then have to reason based on the conclusion to something that looks like God. Another issue I have with the God of the gaps fallacy is often when you hear people say it, they'll inadvertently commit another fallacy. The fallacy is called, oh man, I forgot it. Oh, um, oh man, can't believe I forgot it. I can't remember the exact name, but basically, it's when you presuppose your argument in order to make your argument. So you say, effectively, you're saying, I'm right because my argument's right. And it's like, well, you can't just do that. So if you learn something unknown before, does that take away from God's divine wisdom? No. There's no connection between the two. Exactly. Um, man, now I can't think of the term. Do you remember what know what I'm referring to, Mexican hip hop star? I feel like you would remember. No, part fallacy. It's not exactly that one. It's basically you're assuming the conclusions are right in order to then argue that the argument's right. It's not presuppositional, but I can't remember it. Whatever. Either way, basically, or the other term I like to give it is I call it the naturalism of the gaps. And what this is whenever you say, oh, well, it seems like, and we'll really see this with the teleological argument, say, hey, all this evidence seems to lead to a being that definitely seems to look a lot like God. It's powerful, it has pretty significant knowledge, seems to be able to create things out of not with anything but itself. It is eternal. These seems to indicate something that looks a lot like God. And instead of say, well, sure, it may look like that. But eventually, science will just show, sure, we don't know how to explain how the universe came into existence from nothing. Yes, circular reason. Begging the question. Oh my goodness, thank you so much. I can't believe I forgot that. Awesome. That's exactly the fallacy I was thinking of. And they'll say, well, eventually science will just figure. Well, saying that science is just going to figure out is just to say naturalism is true, therefore you're wrong. Well, that's not an argument. That's just, as you said, begging the question. You're just assuming naturalism is true, therefore science will come up with an answer. And so that is at least, I think, a powerful counter to the God of the gaps argument.
I actually had someone use this question on me before. We didn't, it wasn't like a formal debate or anything like that, so I wasn't able to expand on it too much, but I did say, like, well, science is a study of how creation functions, not how the creator functions. It's looking at the creation itself. The creator is something that's beyond that. So even if there's gaps in science, that's just gaps in what we know about creation, not the creator.
No, that's a great way to go about that. I really like that approach. Because I think it also helps people realize, oh wait, when we're talking about God, we're not talking about something that's in the universe. As strings are talking about, what I talked about, we're not talking about something like Zeus. Is there anything else? Okay. So, actually, I'll start with this. Does anyone have any questions, specifically of clarification of the previous 4 objections? Because those are the 4 objections we're going to cover today. And then the last little bit is going to be talking about what the argument actually proves, what it doesn't prove, and a couple other things. Okay. So, now the question becomes, well, what does the argument actually prove? So, I'm going to argue right now that the argument proves these 5 qualities. It proves that the cause must be personal, massively intelligent, which kind of goes with the personal, powerful, timeless, and immaterial. Now, starting with maybe the more controversial one. Now, you could say that the personal one, you could strike that if you want and say that the argument doesn't prove it if you want to make a more modest case. But I'm going to make the case right now for why personal versus impersonal makes more sense for the cause. The reason why the cause makes more sense as a personal agent is that personal agents possess a quality that non-personal agents don't. And by the way, to clarify personal versus non-personal, I'm talking about, by personal, I mean something like you. Something like the mind, if you want to say soul, spirit, whatever term you want to insert. Something that has a will. And an impersonal agent would be something that doesn't have a will. So think a bulldozer, a computer, a machine, whatever you want. The reason why you need personal agent is that personal agents possess the quality of being able to choose something without a previous cause. This kind of has to deal with free will to an extent. An agent can choose something without being caused to do it, whereas a machine So let's say we had a cause. We say the cause that is actually a machine and that it's pumping out this universe, right? Then the question becomes, what causes the machine to start, or in other words, to make a universe versus not make a universe? It can't. It cannot choose between the two because then you're just adding another cause and then we're going back to square one. Whereas a personal agent can choose. Does that make sense to everyone? Or another way you could think of it is a agent doesn't have to be acted upon in order to do something. It can just do something by itself. And again, if you want to be like, actually, I'm not really sure about this, I want to keep my claims more modest, you can strike this from it, though it will make arguing for God a little bit more difficult in that you now have to think of an argument that proves personhood versus something that's, again, just more of a machine. I'll wait till you two are done typing so that way I don't get ahead of you guys. Yeah.
I think your statement on the will is, one of the greater proofs about God, that there's intent behind creation, and so then you have to ask, is the intent, because you're moving into the moral argument there, is the intent beneficial or malevolent? And it's obviously beneficial to us, the whole ecosystem of nature and how it provides and balances itself out. When you're thinking about will, in regards like your analogy, a bulldozer doesn't have any will. There's an operator behind it. A computer, it doesn't just form itself. With a watchmaker, it makes a watch. And there's purpose behind it. There's intent behind it, and it's beneficial in its operation. Which, when you mix that in with the against all these arguments, it does provide a logical conclusion that there is, God, the concept of God is personable. And then the question goes down to, can you know this person? You come into relationship with this person.
Yeah, and we'll get into an argument similar to the watchmaker argument, which is the argument from design. Now, I think probably the greatest proponent of this argument right now is Stephen Meyer. Stephen and then Meyer. He has done a tremendous amount of work in intelligent design theory, which is basically a form of scientific study in which you look at systems and you try to determine if there's a certain level of complexity reached where it can no longer just be explained by natural causes. And we're going to get into this with a teleological argument, and it's really good stuff. I really love his material. So, does everyone understand the personal agent part? Or I guess I should say, does anyone not quite understand it? And don't feel bad if you don't, because some of this stuff gets really complicated. Okay. So, now, as a personal agent, it seems, I think we can at least intuitively understand that it must be pretty freaking intelligent in order to make the universe. The universe is immensely complex. And we're going to talk about this with, again, the teleological argument. You have all these constants. So you have like the gravitational force, the weak versus strong nuclear forces. I forget all the other ones. But anyways, you have a bunch of these things that are just so incredibly precise. Like precise to a number you actually can't comprehend. And to have all these constants work in this way in order for them to be something like the universe to actually exist, I think highlights a clear and massive intelligence. The next part, powerful. What I basically just mean is the being, this creator or cause, whichever term you want to use. I think creator is more appropriate at this point since it's personal. Made the universe. I think that's kind of obvious. That's obviously an incredibly powerful being, whatever it is. It's also timeless. Well, why is it timeless? Because when we include the universe, we're also talking about time. Before the universe, there is no time. And because there is no time, the being itself must not exist within time, at least before creation. There are some arguments on whether or not it would come into time post-creation, but I'm not getting into those right now. At least before creation, which is what we care about anyways, it is timeless. The other thing is it must be immaterial. Why? Because again, the universe doesn't exist. There is no mass, there is no matter. So this being is immaterial, timeless, powerful, massively intelligent, and personal. Well, we're starting to sound a lot like we're talking about God, don't we? Now, is there anything, any clarification, anything that wants to be added before we move on to our next slide? Yes, Zelda. Thankfully, we are not in the sim. We're not in the simulation. I've thought about actually covering that as a topic, but because I think it is interesting, but I don't think there's enough people who actually believe it to make it worthwhile. Maybe I'll do it for fun. Are there any other questions? Awesome. Okay. So now that we've covered what the argument proves, let's look at what the argument does not prove, because it doesn't prove everything. For one, it does not prove that this creator has to be the Christian God. It does not prove that at all. It does give us some qualities that that don't contradict the Christian God, but it does not argue for the Christian God in particular. Additionally, it makes no case on whether or not the creator is moral. It could be the greatest devil to ever exist, or it could be the greatest positive being to ever exist. It does not matter. The argument does not make a statement one way or the other. Now, it also doesn't make a statement on whether or not the God is monotheistic. Now, I think you could make a probabilistic case that the God is monotheistic. I actually have my own argument I've formulated on this, but it does not, at least by itself, argue this. Do people see why? Or does anyone not see why? I think is maybe the better way I should be formulating these questions. Wouldn't the argument of there being a higher being apply? Okay, so I see where you're going. So there is an argument called the ontological argument, and basically what the ontological argument says is God is the greatest conceivable being. Now, to explain what I mean by conceivable being is that I'm not saying that just because you can't conceive something about God, therefore he doesn't have that thing. So like, oh, well, I can't conceive how God's eternal, therefore he's not eternal. That's not what it means. What it means is that if you could, let's imagine the greatest being you could think of. Let's say, I don't know, all good, all loving, has always existed. I don't know, something like that. And then you're like, oh wait, actually, I could imagine a being that had all those qualities plus one other one other quality that's good. Then that being you just conceived of would then be greater than the previous being, and that being would be God. So it's basically just saying there can't be a being we can imagine better than God, is the very simple way to say it. However, that argument is not applied to the Kalam. Like they're two separate arguments, which is why in the Kalam argument you can't really get the moral stuff, whereas you can in the ontological one. Now we'll actually be talking about the moral argument next time, and that one will actually make the case for why God has to be moral. Or at least if morality exists, he must also exist. And actually I really like I've kind of changed my mind. I used to love the Kalam the most, but I think I'm starting to like the moral argument the most because I think it's it's more philosophically intense, which I actually personally enjoy, and also I feel like the average person understands it more. And you don't have to deal with the weeds of someone citing you some random scientific model that 3 people came up with in their basement, which can be pretty frustrating.
I think that's the hardest thing to grasp in just presenting these from a scientific point of view, because in doing so you're essentially limiting yourself just to the argument itself without taking into consideration the other aspects. Like in that last slide, I can see how if you go along just within that realm of those arguments, you can quite say it doesn't represent God as being Christian, moral, or monotheistic, which is where you need to have the extra information added into it. Because it's very rare you come across a person who can just focus on just one topic, unless you're a scientist, because they can, and they focus just on that one topic without taking into consideration any of the other arguments that can be postulated to undergirth the actual argument for God and who is God or what is God.
Yeah, and I think again, as I talked about earlier, the point of things like the Kalam, the moral, is to say, maybe you're talking to someone and they're like, feel like maybe it's slightly more possible, but I don't think it's guaranteed. Like I think maybe it is possible that there is some scientific model that actually explains it. And you'd be like, okay, maybe that's true. Maybe you're like, let's say you're like 60-40. You're 60 in favor of God, you're 40 against God. Well, okay, well, let's add the moral argument. And let's say in that you're only like 60-40. And then we add the ontological argument. And you're also like, yeah, maybe I'm like 70-30. Well, this combined case is now stronger than each of its individual parts because we're adding a plethora of evidence for our case rather than just going through a single lane of evidence. And so, yeah, I know some people may not like the from the Christian perspective because like, well, you know, it doesn't necessarily prove a Christian God, but I think they're kind of missing the point, which is you don't have to immediately prove everything about God in order to start making your case. And in fact, starting with a more modest one and working your way through these modest cases can make people more open to listening to you because you're not immediately trying to go for 100%. At least that's what I've found personally. And it's also why, as you talk about the science, it's important to remember like the Kalam cosmological argument, although can benefit from scientific study, it does not necessitate it in order to make its argument. It is primarily a philosophical argument that then some can use modern science in order to benefit its case. But it's not the science is not necessary for the case. So that is pretty much everything. If people are interested, because you guys might be, I do have extra studying material if you want to. Not saying you have to. Most of this stuff would take you probably over a year to get through, if I'm being honest, if you went through all of this. But I did order it from easiest material to understand to hardest material to understand. Oh, this is supposed to be theology. Ooh, there we go. I would almost certainly not recommend you start with these two. Do not start with these two books. They're very great books, but unless you have a firm, like a pretty good understanding of philosophy and a decent understanding of science, these things are going to be pretty killer to go through. Like even I very much struggled with understanding them, and I'm going to be rereading at least the Kalam a second time because I don't think I fully understood all the material. But that being said, a lot of this early material, so like Defenders by William Lane Craig, the podcast Reasonable Faith. So that's like a general podcast name. So you'd have to search Kalam Cosmological Argument within that in order to find the material on it. Defender Podcast Series 3, Excursion on Natural Theology. If you look that up on Google, you'll find that there's 4 episodes on the Kalam, and a lot of this material comes from that podcast. Gavin Oyland, Truth Unites. This is another fairly simple video. Why asking what caused God misses the target. It's a really good video. I would highly recommend it. It's only 30 minutes long. It covers, again, sort of what I talked about on why asking what caused God doesn't work. And he also covers a couple different arguments as well. Inspiring Philosophy, A Universe from Nothing, Therefore God Exists. This is very sarcastic. He is a Christian philosopher. And he goes into a lot of the quantum stuff that I didn't go into. Now, for some side material, Punch of the Aquinas has a episode called Does the Kalam Argument Work? With Jimmy Akin. And the whole point of that is to ask from a Christian perspective, does the Kalam argument actually work philosophically speaking? So, if you're interested, that might be some good material as well. If you guys would like, actually, I know I'll just ask you guys now. Do you guys want me to post this material somewhere? Like this extra studying material? Do you want me to send it to you guys?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so I will talk to Mage on how we're going to do that. But once I know, I'll message every single person so we all know where it's being posted. I'll probably grab links and everything. Now, no problem. That being said, is there any last thoughts, concerns, anything else before we close it out? Okay. So, let you guys know, we will be having our next meeting in 2 weeks. 2 weeks from today. Same time as always. We'll be covering, it'll probably be 2-part series again because that seems to be how things are going. And I want to try to make these more interactive. Actually, you know what? I'll ask this. Do you guys prefer the interaction over me just lecturing for like an hour straight. Get some personal feedback, I guess. Okay, awesome. That, you know what? That works great for me as well. So we'll do that next time. And so I'll try to probably split into 2 parts. That way we have enough time for people to give their thoughts. Is honestly, I'm blown away by how many people showed up. It was great to see you guys. Hope you guys have a fantastic night or day, I guess, for you, String, because you're on the other side of the world. And have a great time. God bless you all.